You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
Welcome back to Lecture 4 of my analysis of Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Now, if you heard the previous 3, then you know we are up to the stage of the analysis of the bankers engineering World War II and the background to what happened with that whole disastrous fiasco that, of course, went very well for the international financial elite. Did not go so well for various European countries, and then of course the American empire being dragged into that conflict via the special agent provocateuring. Yes, the special agents from the UK, that being William Stevenson or Intrepid, together with Bill Donovan, effectively convincing the United States to join in the war effort of World War II. And you can read about that in numerous books, including Craig Cobble's book on Ian Fleming. Fleming, of course, had a role in that. Now, does that mean I'm saying that Hitler was good? That Hitlerianism was in itself a great thing? No, I see it as a kind of concocted ideology, and you can look at the ridiculous philosophy of esoteric Hitlerism, Savitri Devi, Miguel Serrano, and these different characters that echo the religious mythology of a figure like Alfred Rosenberg, which is the background, the concocted Teutonic, pagan, Romanesque, I guess you could say, philosophy of the Reich. And quite clearly it has all of the traits of being an engineered religious philosophy, really. And you can look at that with the similarities between both Soviet and fascist artwork, all reflecting the same style and imagery. Just rather a question of which system is going to bring the new era, the new age, the new world order. The communist project for the collective new man, the Germanic project of the Teutonic god race new man, both of those have faded away, and now we have entered the era of the democratic capitalist convergence technocratic new man. So that's going to be the model of the future, and Quigley will have a chapter on that, so we know we're on the right track here. I always have to explain, I'm not pro-Quigley. I understand that Quigley is a propagandist for the Atlanticist Empire. You don't have to tell me that in the comments. I already know that. I've explained every time, I think, that I've given these talks that Quigley is a propagandist. So you needn't remind me of that. I'm well aware. That also does not mean that, therefore, I accept Stalinism as the appropriate system, Hitlerism as the appropriate system, or some other weird ism. I don't think that that's how the real world works, as if there's a great ism that appeared and that we can then resurrect that. Things that go the way of history cannot be resurrected, except in perhaps some sort of propagandist form. Rather, I take a different approach to things. I think that traditional theology is the way out of these dilemmas. And so that's why I would point people to something like Orthodox theology, not to mysticism, not to biological determinism and evolution, or a form of racial theory as the solution to all of this, or some older nationalism. These are all systems that have come and gone. And so we can't go back to those kinds of systems. And in that regard, I would agree with Spengler's analysis of forms coming and going and passing away. There will never be a Roman Empire again. There will never be a Babylonian Empire. These forms have come and gone. Where things will go in the future is, of course, anyone's guess. But certainly the Western Atlanticist elite, through weaponized democracy, appear to have the upper hand and are ruling the globe through the centralized fiat banking model. That is the empire in which we live today. And this is another way that we can see that Spengler was prophetic, in that he said that we live in the era of Homo economicus, economic man, with the dominance of giant financial empires, giant dynasties or cartels, as Quigley will describe them, that in our day are essentially monetary in their locus. So we discussed, and if you haven't heard the first three, I highly recommend you go back and listen to those, because you're not really going to know where we're at. And there will be, of course, links below this to the first three talks. But we saw that the reaction in Germany against the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan is what provoked a lot of the coalescing of the power on the part of the National Socialists. They were able to gain a lot of popularity and centralized power as a result of the failed policies of the Marxists and the leftists and the Republicans and the Democrats and all these other pseudo idealistic, rationalistic plans. And the Nazis were partly successful also because they captured the mythological imagination of the people, whereas these other sort of bankrupt philosophies of democracy and republicanism were not really able to capture anyone's imagination. Arguably, I guess you could say, in various arenas of the global political theater, communism was somewhat able to capture people's imaginations through the idea of achieving preeminence through the class struggle and the creation of the collective new man. But with Germany, of course, the focus is on racial struggle. And of course, all of these are essentially leftist projects insofar as the locus of action for humans and for all human action is placed into the external sphere, something out there in the world, be it class warfare, racial struggle, strife, freedom versus liberty on the part of the Western Atlanticists, freedom versus tyranny. All of these forms are essentially united in their presuppositions of being modern. And that's why I think Dugan is accurate to speak of positions 1, 2, and 3, right? You've got capitalism and libertarian, classical liberalism. You've got communism and fascism, and these three forms have passed away, and we are now in the period of the victory of monetaristic liberalism. Atomistic classical liberalism has won, and that, of course, leads to monopolistic capitalism, which rules the globe presently. Now, so the actions that happened in this period of the 20s and 30s, as we said, really messed up the German economy. There was hyperinflation. The Dawes Plan and the subsequent Young Plan were these restructuring of the debt that was owed supposedly by the German population. Weimar Republic failed, and so you have a lot of industrialists who have a lot of money wrapped up in the German economy and other arenas of the economic sphere that needed to see a successful Germany. And this is where the industrialists step in to fund Hitler. I.G. Farben, Henry Ford, right? Henry Ford wrote a book openly about this. And this is interesting because the Nazis are not a, quote, right-wing party. They are a people's party and they're National Socialists. So they are not part of the classical liberal dialectic of atomistic individualism. But they also understand, in their perspective, that already by the 20th century, it was a global world. And due to the free trade and economic excommunication policies on the part of the West, Germany was essentially forced into the global theater, I guess is what you could say. So in other words, you can't really play global politics as a mere nation state. In other words, we're already into what Quigley calls the power block and great powers model of how things play out in the global theater. So you can't just have nationalism. You've got to have a battle for the New World Order. And which form will that New World Order take? And of course, amongst historians, researchers, alternative researchers, independent researchers, conspiracy theorists, really the question of the 20th century is to what degree, this is of course the debated contentious point, is to what degree is this engineered in the background. And so we are looking at one of the key sources for it being engineered in the background, and that is of course Carroll Quigley. So we have the beer hall putsch and the rise of National Socialism. The SS begins to stamp out the leftist groups, the communists that stood in the way. We have Quigley mentioning the Reichstag being burned and it being blamed on the communists as a form of false flag, according to Quigley. And this is what leads to the Enabling Act, which allows Hitler to gain quite a bit of power. Quigley argues that the Nazis enact a terror state. All the Reds are rounded up and arrested. There's a takeover and federalization of local police. Now, keep in mind that we hear a lot about the Stasi and but this is what this is what the Bolsheviks did too. Okay, so this is pretty much the standard pattern of large-scale power blocks. Period. Okay, and it's not any different, obviously, in the U.S. Right? In the U.S., supposedly this democracy or Republican democracy, Democratic Republic, whatever you want to call it, they did the same thing. Right? We had internment camps for Japanese, so forth and so on. So let's not be naive here and think that this is like good guy, bad guy. Religion is somewhat strange under the Nazis. There's a period of tolerance for Catholicism, and then this kind of fizzles out and disintegrates, and the Nazis and the Catholics end up kind of having a falling out, which is difficult given the fact there were quite a few Catholics in Germany. And Quigley on 441, of course, mentions the concocted ideology of Rosenberg to create the mythology for the Nazi Party. Non-Aryans, Jews, persons married to non-Aryans, politically unreliables, and Marxists were discharged, and loyalty to Nazism was required for promotion in civil service and government. Now we are in the 30s period, as we said, so this is still not any period where there's large internment camps yet. And according to Quigley, Nazism in this period was not totalitarian. So it's authoritarian, but it is not a totalitarian. Quigley says by 1934, the Nazi movement reached the goal of the establishment of an authoritarian state in Germany. The word used here is authoritarian, for unlike the fascist regime in Italy, the Nazi regime was not totalitarian. This is by he's talking about in the period of the 30s into the 40s. So we're not yet at World War II yet. We're still in the build-up period. The Nazi movement, he says, in its simplest analysis, was an aggregation of gangsters, neurotics, mercenaries, the discontented, and an intermixture of idealists. This movement was built up by the quartet, mentioned earlier in the last lecture, of counter-revolutionary force against the Weimar Republic, the Internationalists, and the Democrats. And of course against the Communists as well. So basically, the right wing ended up in more or less a union against all of those movements, and that's why the Nazi Party would be called far right, even though it was originally a socialist workers' party. It ends up united in its opposition to Weimar Republic, the Internationalists, that being the capitalists and or Catholics, Democrats, and Communists. Now, Quigley mentions the different entities that he sees funding the Nazis, and this would be, he mentions Fritz Thyssen, he mentions Farben, and of course I said Henry Ford, and many others. Let's see. I was looking for my notes here. There's a place where he actually mentions a whole bunch of them, but I'm not seeing it. But those are, of course, the main players. And then you've got a lot of the big corporations that still exist today. Volkswagen, right? People's car service. Now, these are all behind the Nazi war machine. Other companies as well. I think Bayer Pharmaceutical, or whatever it used to be at one point, was involved in that. There's quite a few giant Germanic industrial companies that quite clearly are tied into American interests, and there was a sizable support for Hitlerianism in the 30s on the part of Americans. I believe Hitler was on Time magazine at one point, and he was not conceived to be a great villain in the 30s and 40s. It was only after this period when you have a real decision on the part of the financial elite, and I would say the industrial barons, to go ahead with the next big war, and that's where you need this great villain. So there is an attempt in Germany to put an end to competition. This is interesting because we're, of course, told in the modern era that the only way that economies are successful is through everybody competing with each other. And what international monetarism and libertarian economic policy ultimately does, and why the bankers liked it a long time ago, it's particularly the time of the French Revolution, where it allowed the merchant class to supplant the aristocratic and monarchical class, the feudal state, was that it says that you need to compete against everybody, right? You need to have widespread economic competition, and that's the only way for things to advance, right? This is the libertarian myth. And what does this do? Well, it creates from the outset the tendency for everyone in a community or in a country to be set against one another, because the goal becomes avarice. The goal becomes the accumulation of more wealth. And that's why this was always forbidden in the ancient and medieval church. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that at a local level you didn't have people making a living and having businesses or doing a trade. You had guilds and you had trades and so forth. You didn't have Adam Smith economics. You didn't have David Ricardo and these figures who would influence a lot of the revolutionaries in France and in America, right? And so that's why it's part of the Enlightenment, is that it becomes about pragmatic end goals, right? About hedonistic, materialistic end goals, right? Being successful in this life, whereas the ancient and medieval European and Byzantine perspective was that the end goals are in the next life, right? The accumulation of great wealth is not what it means to be successful. But post scientific revolution, post economic revolution, industrial revolution, it more and more becomes the dominant mindset and philosophy of the West and now the globe that the attainment of fiat dollars now, I guess at one time it was at least gold or assets, the attainment of fiat dollars is really the essence of life. And that's why Spengler calls it Homo economicus. And economic interests have replaced the older interests of telos, which in the Greek means purpose. So ancient and medieval men consider themselves to have some higher, greater purpose than merely their own temporal accumulation of gold or goods or fiat dollars. That, of course, has completely shifted in the great inversion of the last several centuries, foisted by financial interests, banking dynasties, Masonic revolutionaries, and so forth, and then later, of course, Marxism, which says that any hopes of something in the afterlife are really bourgeois inventions to keep the masses and the workers enslaved. And I would remind you that, of course, the internationalists, the capitalists, like the idea of Marx, right? That the end goal of life is the accumulation of material success and perhaps wealth in some sense. Even though Marx, as I said many times, was not anti-capitalist, he was a critic of capitalism, but capitalism was a necessary stage on the long march of history towards the withering away of the state. Marx the libertarian. But we see Volkswagen, the People's Auto, we see Göring Werks, Hermann Göring, and the 65 corporations that form the Labor Front in 1938 that support the move of Hitler because it's obviously advantageous to German interests to oppose a lot of the internationalists in terms of at least the financial sector. But you have this economic sector, this industrial sector, which is very powerful in Germany and is linked with many groups in the U.S., such as Ford, who are pro-Hitler for that reason. Like, they would rather see an Axis bloc rather than the Allied bloc as the model for the New World Order. And as I said, I think last time I got into Britain in this period, which Quigley calls a plutocracy. He calls it UK in this period is the great plutocracy. And the wars have a very detrimental effect on the UK economy. And this is really where we see the decline of the United Kingdom and the centralization of at least the projection of force geopolitically that arises in the United States. So even though we could still see, I think, the U.S. as a kind of proxy shell company or force for the city of London, it's not the U.K. as a kind of nation or an economy that's really a major power anymore. Now, certainly the Bank of England, the City of London, this is an independent city-state that is a international locus of power, but that's what kind of secretly is running the United States in accord with the New York banking elite, the Eastern establishment, and by extension, the Pentagon and the White House. Those are all entities that are run by the New York banks and the City of London. That's the way to understand this. And so it's not Britain, it's not the UK that's that's the evil empire here. It's a shadow empire of the banking establishment that Quigley identifies on page 474, for example, with both members of the ruling elite in the British upper crust. The Cecil family controls the Conservative Party. Balfour, it looks like, I think, or Salisbury, Lord Selborne, these are all involved in either controlling the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party, the Labour Party. So you got landed, wealthy, aristocratic elites, Royal Society group members, Lord Milner, Balfour, Stead, Rosebery, the Astors, and what they do is they essentially run either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. But this Cliveden set, this group, they are pretty much united, right? They form a kind of inner circle of initiates, is what Quigley calls them from Cecil Rhodes, and they run the four ends of the court. And this is the British government, and the four ends, INN, means the Inner Temple, the Middle Temple, Lincoln's Temple, and Gray's Temple. And these ends are monopolized by the upper class. Quigley says this on page 479. Inner Temple, Middle Temple, Lincoln's Inn, and Gray's Inn. Very, very Masonic, obviously. Oxford and Cambridge are, of course, the elite schools by which the upper crust, Eton as well, are recruited into the circles, the inner circles. You have the outer party, inner party that Orwell talked about, and they come from these elite schools, and then are recruited into British intelligence or whatever. And as I said, so we got the Conservatives being ruled, Quigley argues, by Lord Salisbury and Arthur Balfour. And of course, Balfour is the origin of the modern state of Israel with the Balfour Declaration. And you've got the Liberals being controlled by different elites, but it's still, as he said, moneyed elites. Let's see who I'm looking for, the liberal list of elites that run them. But I mean, it's not any different today. We see this still with Blair and Cameron and all these different phony balonies who are essentially just mirrored versions of the left-right dialectic of the Democrats and Republicans, right? It's like Clinton and the Bushes, right? There's no difference. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Britain, but he says a couple interesting points. 489, that the bankers control the public works. The bankers control the Labour Party. The bankers control and institute austerity. The BBC is set up by the elite, right? British Broadcasting Company is a, quote, public work, but it's controlled by the banking elite. No surprise. That's why we've said from a long time, obviously, the BBC is run by MI6. It's pretty obvious, or MI5, either way. And so these front people like Neville Chamberlain or Churchill, these are just, these are kind of the front men like Obama today. And this is all explained more or less explicitly in chapter 10 by Quigley here. But we don't really have to dwell much on London and the UK. Because in the next chapter, it's really going to be about about World War II. And so he talks a little bit more about Britain and the economic collapse, the merchant bankers in Britain that run things. The Bank of England runs businesses. Here we have another explanation of who's running things, page 500. Who runs things in England? Well, it's pretty clearly Baring Brothers, Rothschild, Schroeder, Morgan, Greenfell, Hambros, Lazard. These more or less have the dominant, he says, the financial capitalism have the dominant position in the Bank of England. So the Bank of England, giant powerhouse, run by these dynasties and families. Page 500. So the heyday of English financial capitalism is associated with the governorship of Montague Norman from 1920 to 1944. It began about a century after the advent of industrial capitalism, Barings, Westminster Bank, etc., etc., etc. And it leads from financial capitalism into monopoly capitalism. And so he talks about a bunch of monopolies that are all interlocking directorates into the Bank of England. And that's how we get to international monopoly capitalism. This is all on page 500. So the Bank of England ends up running all of the big businesses. The Big Five controlled the majority of the economy. And this is Midland, Lloyds, Barclays, Westminster, and National Provincial. These are the Big Five banks tied into the Bank of England that run the economy. And this is what we see in the U.S., isn't it? You've got regional Federal Reserve banks that are tied into private banks, and that runs the U.S. economy, sort of. What a mess. Now, there's an interesting section on International Monetary Fund. Quigley says on page 506 that to gather much of the traditional dinginess of the English lower class life was wiped away, brightening it up with amenities which contributed to the increase of solidarity of family life. Slum clearance and rebuilding by local government bodies called council houses added to this. Britain's formerly independent role in these matters has come increasingly under the influence of outside influences, becoming a part of the EU. So the United States, the European Common Market, the IMF have had a powerful influence in the British economy. And that's what, as I was saying, that it's not really Britain that is running things, right? Because the British economy really sinks, Quigley argues, during this period. And it's more so the big banking houses in New York that step up to the plate to take the lead, and the international institutions take on a bigger role in Britain. This is, of course, why Brexit was kind of an issue of late. But it is still the big banking houses located in the city of London and in New York that are the shadow government. Don't ever forget that. But interlocking dictatorships of cartels that lead to total corporatism, Quigley argues on 511. And this international cartel model in Germany, in England, and in the U.S., that is where we see the rise of monopoly capitalism. And so it's this is why it's giant families like Vanderbilt's, Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, these corporations are tied into big international banking syndicates, and this is what he calls the cartels. And so you might have a German cartel, you might have a U.S. cartel, you might have cooperations between them, the British and the DuPonts, for example. He says among these agreements was most significantly the European dye-stuff cartel. This grew out of a Swiss cartel from 1918 when I.G. Farben was reorganized in 1925, and a similar French organization, the Kuhlmann Group, was set up in 1927. And these two formed a French-German cartel. All three countries set up the European cartel in 1929. Imperial Chemicals, which won a near monopoly on British territory in 1926, joined the European cartel in 1931. The British group already had a comprehensive agreement with DuPont in the United States, right? And an effort by I.G. Farben to create a joint monopoly with DuPont within the U.S. Leads, again, as he says, to these giant cartels and monopolies. I.G. Farben was the greatest example of concentrated control in Germany monopoly capitalism, but it was no means untypical. And he goes on to list on page 513 many more of these. I.G. Farben and the United Steelworks had 1.3 billion Reichsmarks in capital. Now, this is in 1930s money, so that's quite a bit. So what these monopoly capitalists are businessmen first and patriots later. So they're internationalists, and that's what's key to understand here. As a result, the goals of German cartels were frequently political as well as economic. I.G. Farben and others were constantly working to help Germany in a struggle for power through espionage, gaining economic advantages for Germany, and by seeking to cripple the ability of other countries. So what we see is kind of a competition between cosmopolitan international capitalism and industrial national capitalism. So that's kind of what we can see as a bit of a dialectical warfare within capitalism. Will it be nationalist and industrialist, or will it be internationalist and industrialist? And of course, we know where things go. They move towards internationalism. And of course, Germany loses in this battle, and the internationalists gain the upper hand. And then we have the European Common Market in the 1950s following World War II. So it allows the ECM to be established, of course, at Bilderberg. As we know, those documents are no longer secret. They're public. Bilderberg planned in the late 40s after World War II. Bretton Woods system as a result of World War I and the BIS. Then you have the European Common Market through Bilderberg. And it required the destruction of Germany to get that in place. Now, France. Now, this is going to be a crucial chapter. This is very important because it's not so much that France is like, it's an important factor in all this. But what's most enlightening about Quigley's chapter on France is that the model for how France was taken over by the banking dynasties is super duper illustrative for how it works everywhere. That's what's so fascinating about this chapter, is that we're going to see Quigley going all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. He's going to explain the interchange between the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Jews and their big banking houses, and how it all played out in the consolidation and rule, basically, of the entire French banks by the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds are going to take it over, and they're going to be the final dominant power, I think, by the time of the 40s. But you're also going to get some really interesting insights from Quigley on what's going on in the U.S. and the New Deal, and how the New Deal was a scam, and how it's, again, another pattern of what you'll see. So this is a very important chapter, and I've been talking about this in interviews in the last month leading up to this talk, and that's why this is going to be so important. So I want you to listen, because you're going to see the exact pattern of how the banking elite do the exact same thing in every country, and how this is how they created the New World Order. And this is what Quigley said from the very beginning, where he talked about the bankers and the gold notes and the plan for a global one world currency and a new world order and all that. Here is the representative example of how it was done in detail in France. Financial capitalism lasted longer in France than in any other major country. The roots of the financial capital there, like Holland, but unlike Germany, go back to the period of commercial capitalism which preceded the Industrial Revolution. These roots grew up rapidly in the last half of the 18th century and were well established with the founding of the Bank of France in 1800. At that date, financial power was in the hands of about 15 private banking houses, whose founders, in most cases, had come from Switzerland in the second half of the 18th centuries. These bankers were all Protestant and were deeply involved in the agitations that led up to the French Revolution. Interesting. Swiss Protestant bankers, and I would suggest probably British as well, funding the French Revolution. Little nugget from Quigley there that I have not found that anywhere else, so make note of that. When the revolutionary violence got out of hand, they were the chief forces behind the rise of Napoleon. Interesting. What does all this do? Consolidates. That's what's key. As a reward for the support, Napoleon in 1800 gave the bankers a monopoly over French financial life. So if you want to understand what Napoleon was all about, there you go. That's page 515 in Quigley. Napoleon, agent of the bankers, to give them the entire French economy through the control of what was created in 1800? The Bank of France. Now, was the Bank of France a public works, communal bank? No. Quigley says it was not. There were 3 groups of bankers who had the controlling interests in this private bank with a public facade. That is the model everywhere. Quigley says The figures in this bank were Mirabaud, Mallet, Neuflize, and Hottinger. In the course of the 19th century, a second group was added to the French banking circles, the Jewish bankers. And also, they were of non-French origin and were largely Germanic. They were Rothschild, Heine, Fuld, Stern, and Worms. The majority of the Iberians, and a minority of Iberian Jews like Perrier and Miret. A rivalry soon grew up between the older Protestant banking elites and the nouveau riche Jewish banking. This rivalry was largely political, not so much religious in basis. The lines were confused by the fact that some of the Jewish bankers gave up their religion and became Protestants, such as Perrier and Heine. The rivalry, well, there's a lot of talk about rivalry here. So long story short, the leadership of the Jews was headed by Rothschild, obviously, and he was on the right wing of that group. The two wings were also close to that of Mirabaud, together that dominated the whole of the financial system, frequently cooperated together, even when the groups as a whole were in competition. Key point. The simpler picture was complicated when, after 1838, by the slow rise of a third group of bankers, the Catholics. This was names such as Desmarchis, Sellier, Davilliers, de Germany, Pilleville, Gouin, and de Lubersac. They rose slowly and lately. It was soon split into two halves. One half was the alliance of the Rothschilds and the accepted group of the Third Republic, and the other half was the alliance of the industry, largely Catholic, and the Second Empire. This is a bit confusing here. Thus, there were, from 1871 all the way to 1900, three groups in France. The alliance of the Jews and Catholics, dominated by Rothschild. Now, when you think of Vatican Bank, remember that since the 1700s, the Rothschilds have run the Vatican Bank. That's public knowledge, not a conspiracy theory. The second group, the alliance of Catholic industrialists and Catholic bankers, dominated by Schneider and steel manufacturing, and a group of Protestant bankers dominated by Mirabaud. So three big economic powerhouses here. Banker power rises after 1900, Quigley says in France, and basically what you get after Napoleon is, as we said, the establishment of the Bank of France. Now listen, this is crucial. The center of French economic system in the 20th century was not to be found in the Bank of France. What? But in a group of unknown institutions and private banks. There were over 100 private banks, but only about a score were of significance. And even these were restricted to two, Mirabaud and Rothschild. They were the most powerful of all the others combined. The private banks were known as the Haute Banque and acted as the high command of the French economic system. Their stock was closely held in the hands of 40 families, and they issued no reports on their financial activities. Double books, secret system, shadow banking. They were, with a few exceptions, the same private banks that set up the Bank of France. Duh. They were divided into a group of 7 Jewish banks: Rothschild, Stern, Cohen, Daveners, Proper, Lazard, Spitzer, Worms. 7 Protestants: Mallet, Mirabaud, Heine, Neuflize, Hottinger, Odier, Vernet. And 5 Catholic banks: Davilliers, Lubersac, Le Chédier, Gaudier, and Desmarchis. By the 20th century, the basic fissure to which we have referred had appeared between the Jews and the Protestants, and the Catholic group had split to ally itself with either the Jews or the Protestants. The Jews or the Protestants. Nonetheless, the various groups continued to cooperate in the management of the entire French economy and the Bank of France. The Bank of France was not the center of financial capitalism except in name. It possessed no autonomous power of its own. It was controlled until 1936, as it had been in 1813, by the hands of the private banks that created it. So it was a front. It was a shell. Sound like anything you've heard of? Maybe the Federal Reserve? The Bank of France was controlled by the same 40 families, not 200, as many thought, but because the provision of the bank's charter stated that only the 200 largest stockholders were entitled to vote on decisions. And so you had 200 largest stockholders, but those 200 largest stockholders were made up of 40 families. So that apparent dispersion of power was illusory, Quigley says. So this is the Federal Reserve trick. The Federal Reserve was established, the French model Federal Reserve here, the Bank of France, as a result of the French Revolution. What did they do? They had a revolution. They had so-called capitalism and so forth, a merchant class taking over. This is a disastrous failure. A whole bunch of people die in the different communes and French governments that are set up. Napoleon comes as the great dictator consolidator. And what does he do? Gives it all over to bankers. There you go. So it's the same scam model everywhere. The Bank of France acted as a kind of general staff for the 40 families that controlled the 19 chief private banks, Little effort was made to influence the affairs by the rediscount rate, and open market operations were not used until 1938. The state was influenced by the Treasury's need for funds from the Bank of France. Other banks were influenced by the methods more exclusively French. The alliances used indirect bribery and by complete dependence of the French banks on the Bank of France for any crisis. In other words, it was centralized. This last arose from the fact that the French banks did not emphasize gold reserves, but instead regarded commercial paper as their chief reserve, fiat. In any crisis where this paper could not be liquidated fast enough, the banks resorted to unlimited note issuing by the Bank of France. Unlimited note issuing by the Bank of France, fiat dollars. Guess what happens? Well, the Rothschilds dominate. They consolidate, intermarry, or disperse the other families, get rid of them. And you have complete control by a single cartel by, what does he say? I think by the middle of the 20th century, I think he says. And he discusses this on page 522, this kind of weeding out of the competition, or the faux competition, and just greater centralization. Inside France, there was a basic division of East and West. The Jewish group emphasized shipbuilding, transatlantic communications, transportation. The Protestant Catholic group emphasized iron, steel, so forth. This rivalry between the two groups had worldwide ramifications. For example, Jewish bankers controlled the Carnegie Petrol, which was allied with Standard Oil and Rockefeller. So Jewish bankers allied with Rockefellers and Carnegies. Catholic Protestant bankers at this time allied with Royal Dutch Shell and Protestants and Daterding. So there is, even at the banking level, some degree of difference. But here's what happens. The Jewish group frequently joined the cartels and associations set up by the rival blocs. At the center of the system of monopolistic industrial control was the Confédération Générale du Patronat Franc, which after 1936 did the collective bargaining for most of the French industry. The Confederation was divided into sections for different industry. Around the Confederation was a series of general trade associations and cartels, etc., etc. Below these was a number of regional associates and local cartels, and these were integrated into a single whole by financial controls, family alliances, and interlocking positions. In this system, the Comte de Forget Trade Association of the metallurgical industries held a key position. So eventually what we get by 1870 is the whole metal industry of France turned towards monopoly centralization. So, in other words, monopoly control, it's this gradual movement towards monopoly control. Right? Now, the Paribas system, this is the Rothschild system, as it's called according to page 525. The whole Paribas system of France in the 20th century was headed by Baron Edouard de Rothschild, but the active head was René Meyer, manager of the Rothschild Bank and nephew by marriage of James Rothschild. The chief center of operations for the system was the Banque de Paris, which was managed until 1937 by Horace Fanelli of a Hungarian Jewish family, brought to France by the Rothschilds in 1880. From this bank was ruled much of the section of many foreign colonial enterprises, utilities, shipping, airlines, blah, 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 everything foreign-wise. Havas was a great monopolistic news agency, so the Rothschilds had set up their own controlled monopolistic news agency, as well as advertising, and they could and did suppress and spread news and advertising as they willed. It usually supplied news, reports, basically just saying that's a monopoly on media in France at this point, and we are in the 1930s. There was a monopoly from this power block of the Rothschilds on the distribution of periodicals, books. This monopoly could be used to kill paper stories, which were regarded as objectionable. The Paribas bloc was badly split, however, between the rise of anti-Semitism in France and the controversy over orthodox and unorthodox financial methods and banking, and the foreign crisis, World War II. The Rothschilds desired to form an alliance with Russia and adapt a policy of resistance to Hitler while supporting the loyalists in Spain, continuing orthodox financial policies and building up the labor unions against the Comte de Forget. And it collapsed from its own internal contradictions, their own lack of faith in it, and the pressure of Great Britain. So this monopolistic system, he says, collapses, which isn't exactly the case. Maybe that model collapsed, but the Paribas bloc, he says, was destroyed by the anti-Semitic laws. So the Rothschild power structure in the mid-century apparently lost some of its power, and but I'm not. I guess you could argue to what degree this is really the case. I mean, these entities are so powerful that does the anti-Semitic laws really affect it? Maybe to some degree, but this is where we get the argument that the three pre-war power blocks played no significant role in France since 1945. Although some of the personnel of the Paribas system have done so, notably René Meyer, the head of the Rothschild family. So apparently the Rothschilds, he says, are still powerful in France, but they're not what they were in the 1940s. So you can debate that to whatever degree you'd like. That is at least Quigley's argument. The British, let's see, he says, the British, who had formed a European Free Trade Association of the outer seven nations of Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, to seek free trade among the members, but no common external tariff against others, sought to lift its rather lethargic economy by joining the European Common Market in 1962. This was rebuffed by de Gaulle, who required as a price that Britain renounce its efforts to establish a special relationship for the United States. This is interesting because de Gaulle saw the special relationship between the UK and the US as the means by which the British elites were engineering a lot of this warfare and baloney in Europe. And that's why de Gaulle said, okay, if you want free trade, then you got to cut off this relationship with the U.S. And that's why de Gaulle was not popular. The Atlanticists very much sought to destroy de Gaulle. So that covers the role of the Rothschilds in France and how they consolidated power by the 1930s and 40s to create a single dynasty of control of the French economy and private sector for the most part. Quigley argues that anti-Semitic laws damaged the Rothschild power structure. You can debate to what degree you agree or disagree with that. I will leave the matter open, but as I am here at this point to give you Quigley's argument, that is what Quigley says. And in hour 2, we're going to look at the rise of the European Common Market, the Treaty of Rome, the OECD. Interesting. Here comes the OECD into the picture. We're going to see a little bit about what that is, and what is happening in the U.S. in the 30s and 40s to lead up to World War II. And this is going to be important because, as I said, there's a bunch that's revealed about FDR, the New Deal, and how this was a big banker scam as well on the part of the oligarchs in the U.S. and how this led to consolidation. Again, mirroring what we saw with the Rothschilds and the bankers in the Bank of France and Napoleon handing over the entire French economy to the bankers. Well, guess what? FDR is going to hand over the entire U.S. economy for subsequent decades in greater concentration to the bankers. So you've been listening to Jay Dyer. This is lecture 4 on Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. We've been looking at France and the bankers and Germany and what their plans are. And we're almost to World War II. And in hour 2, we're going to look at FDR and how he was an agent of the banking elite. And so stay tuned for that. Check out jaysanalysis.com. Subscribe to my talks and lectures for $4.95 a month or $60 a year if you want to hear the full talks and lectures and interviews. I've got amassed quite an archive now, 95% approval rating there. So definitely check that out. You can buy my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, at Trine Day Publishers or on Amazon or at my site, Jay's Analysis. Also check out Jamie Hanstraw's book, Hollywood Mind Control.